Welcome everyone to this week's ICEJ webinar series. We just showed a promo of this new launch of a weekly webinar on Thursday afternoons. Today is a special 5 o'clock time, but we'll probably be doing it 4 o'clock going forward. Every week we're going to be rotating topics between Bible study, Torah study with some of our Jewish rabbi friends. We'll have current affairs like we're having now on the International Criminal Court. It's ruling against Israel. We'll be looking at some of our aid projects, giving you more in-depth on the work that the Christian Embassy is doing here in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, around the world. And we'll have feast webinars and other things, a rotating topic every week. So please be sure to join us every week around this time on Thursday afternoons, Israel time, for our weekly webinar. And welcome once again to part 2 of our special program on the International Criminal Court's ruling that it could investigate and probe and try Israel for war crimes in the Palestinian and the territories, what they consider Palestinian state. Last week, we looked at the whole background and context, got some good information from our guests. We had a legal advisor from the Foreign Ministry of Israel, Amit Hoyman, who gave us some very good information, Israel's take on this. Of course, Andrew Tucker from Think, who is with us again this week. And today we're looking more at a call to action. Take the things that we learned last week about this ruling, how it was bad on both the jurisdiction question and on the substance of whether Israel's committed war crimes or not. And we want to now bring everyone together on courses of action, a call to action. What can we do to help confront this move by the international community, this International Criminal Court? Who are the friends and people we can partner with out there to try and make a change in this? It's not set in stone. It's a long process. The wheels of justice move slowly, and there's really an opportunity here to make a difference for Israel in getting this off of its back. And we first want to begin today's webinar with a message from someone at the Foreign Ministry. We want to thank Sharon Regev, who is the head of the World Religions Department at the Foreign Ministry. She's the main liaison to the pro-Israel Christian community there, and she helped us get someone from their legal department last week. This week, she arranged for Ambassador Noam Katz. He's the Deputy Director General for Public Diplomacy at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Because we are at Erev Purim, and happy Purim to everyone. This is an important Jewish holiday. They're all home with their families. They've given us a recorded message, and we want to thank them again for cooperating with us, partnering with us in this 2-part webinar series on the ICC ruling. Just a little more background on Ambassador Katz. He served in the IDF, rose to the rank of a major, earned a BA in history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He joined Israel's diplomatic corps in 1994, and he served in several postings at the Israel Embassy in Washington, D.C. as their public diplomacy officer. He's been several postings in Eastern Europe and in Africa, including as Israel's ambassador to Nigeria, to Ghana, and to the West African Economic Community. And a special note to our topic today, Ambassador Katz was part of the official delegation at the 2001 Durban conference, where this whole delegitimization campaign against Israel first started taking root. So Kay, if you can play Ambassador Katz's message for us. Thank you.
Shalom from Jerusalem. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you and for your ongoing support of the State of Israel. Tonight, we celebrate the holiday of Purim, and I will be reading from the book of Esther later this evening. The book of Esther is about the attempt of Haman, a villain and advisor to the king of Persia, to annihilate the Jewish people. It is a striking reminder of today's reality, where the Iranian regime, led by radical ayatollahs, continually states its goal of annihilating the State of Israel, all the while making serious efforts at achieving nuclear capabilities. I can assure you that Israel is strong and will never let this happen. We thank God that today we have many friends, among them you. You have all been briefed before on the ICC pre-trial chambers decision that the court has jurisdiction in the Palestinian case. This decision is dead wrong, damaging, and destructive. It is wrong legally, morally, and practically. Legally, the ICC's decision is deeply flawed. From the very beginning, we said that the court does not have jurisdiction in the Palestinian case. Israel is not a party to the ICC and has not consented to its jurisdiction. In fact, only sovereign states can delegate jurisdiction to the court, and a Palestinian state does not exist. This is not only Israel's view, but the opinion of the presiding judge himself, of the 7 state parties who submitted their legal position to the court in advance, and of the countries like Germany, Austria, Australia, and the US, who have all reacted against the court decision. The very strong minority report of the presiding judge who opposed the pre-trial chamber's decision is proof that even in the court there is doubt on the issue of jurisdiction. If there is a doubt, then there should be no doubt. This should serve as a strong message to the prosecutor. But this is not just a technical issue. It is a moral one too. And morally, the court's decision is profoundly wrong and bad. The ICC was designed to confront the world's worst atrocities, but instead, it has allowed itself to become a political tool. It is wrongfully chasing Israel, a democracy, on political issue that should be settled through dialogue. The quick establishment of diplomatic relations with the United Emirates, with Bahrain and Morocco recently proved that this is the way to deal with political differences. An investigation will be extremely damaging to the relations between Israelis and Palestinians. I find it hard to believe that the toxic environment that opening investigation will create will be conducive to peace and to bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. Moreover, opening an investigation will erode the legitimacy of a court that has already been harmed by its reputation for chasing democracies, corruption, and wasting resources. For me, it would be a betrayal of the noble mission that the court was supposed to represent. Israel was in a small group of countries that supported the establishment of an international court to hold the worst violators of human rights accountable. Ultimately, however, we were suspicious that the court may be at risk of politicization, and this is why we didn't ratify the Rome Statute. We need you and everyone to voice strongly at every opportunity that the court has made a grave mistake that threatens the legitimacy and the values it was established for. This is essentially a litmus test, If the court continues to persecute Israel and open the door to politicization, then it won't be working for the principle it was created for, but instead will become another international body with limited legitimacy and limited capabilities. What the court needs is not to open investigation, but to save its own credibility. The court must be saved from continuing down this mistaken path. I've spoken about the court's decision, but I must say a few words about the Palestinian case. The allegations that have been made against Israel are false and vicious. They are an attempt to turn people who have simply defended themselves into criminals. They ignore the fact that Israel has historic claim to its ancestral land. These are exactly the things that would be and should be discussed around the negotiating table. We need strong voices saying that the court has no authority and no jurisdiction to open an investigation. We need people to echo these messages in the public sphere, in articles, in conversation, and on social media. To conclude, this decision is shameful, wrong, and destructive, and it should not be cooperated with. I thank you for your time today and hope that you will make sure your voices are heard.
Yes, again, thank you to Ambassador Katz for his contribution tonight. It's a strong message that we need to raise our voices, really in a way to save the court from undermining its own credibility by being manipulated in this way by the Palestinians, which it dilutes the real power. The International Criminal Court was founded to really deal with and end impunity for unimaginable crimes that shock the conscience. And here, I don't think it's so shocking that a Jewish person builds a house in their ancient biblical homeland. This is the absurdity that we're dealing with here, and we can all raise our voice in this effort. We now want to go to The Hague, where the International Criminal Court is situated, and our partners there, our friends at the THINK, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. Last week we had Andrew Tucker, who's an international lawyer, who helped co-found this initiative to be an asset of a legal think tank for the just in general, but especially for the pro-Israel Christian community worldwide, to have them as an asset for dealing with some of the issues that Israel faces in the area of lawfare more and more these days. And his colleague, co-founder, is Pieter Hoogendoorn, the director of operations for THINK. We promoted him here on the promo for this week. And I really am eager to introduce him because he studied electronics, mathematics, and computer science at the Technical University of Delft, or as the locals there say, Delft. And that is where my wife is from. It's her hometown in Holland. So Pieter, yeah, that's a good university. And he's been a senior business consultant, project manager, really has a long career in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. He was also a volunteer, I guess, on a kibbutz here in Israel many years ago. But in 2017, he co-founded with Andrew and others the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, and he's their director of operations now. And I think you will play a role, and then Andrew will also have a contribution. So Pieter, please.
Thank you very much, David, for this kind introduction. In particular, to make compliments to the city of Delft, which indeed holds one of the oldest universities in the Netherlands. It is still a technical university, and it seems that I've drifted away from technology quite a bit, but it has taken me around the globe, and wherever I was, I've always found people who I could share the love for Israel that was piece and parcel of my education. I myself was born in the green heart of Holland, born and raised in a Christian family with the love for Israel, and that has been a crimson thread throughout my life. And I was only happy enough that when I came to an age that many of you still are looking up to, but when you get retired and you don't want to stop work, you look for an opportunity to do something really useful. And that was when I met Andrew, and together we, with a mutual friend of ours, we founded the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation 4 years ago. And what makes it special is that we are based in The Hague. That's the seat of the foundation. That's close to the institutions for international law. As you know, the International Court of Justice, which is a UN institution, is based in The Hague, in the former Peace Palace. But there's the International Criminal Court, which is, by the way, not a UN institution, but my colleague Andrew will clarify that. And then all the international tribunals, or many of those, are also taking place in The Hague. So from that perspective, we are well positioned. But using modern technology, we are able to grow an international network around the globe of international law experts who all share our vision, and that is a world of peace where countries live in peace together as neighbors and cooperate, as expressed in the Charter of the United Nations. We are not a Christian organization ourselves, but for sure we're Christian Zionists. And all the people in our network share the same mission and the same conviction that international law is being misused against the state of Israel, and that ultimately the effect of this is to the detriment of the Palestinian people. We believe that Israel, Jews and Palestinians should and could live in peace together. And the actions that are actually taking place, also in the United Nations, are not in favor of the Palestinians, and of course not in favor of Israel too. Yet, like you said, David, there is light at the end of the tunnel. The Abraham Accords that were signed last year are a clear indication that there are Muslim people who realize that Israel is not the problem, but that Israel and good relations with Israel is a solution to many problems in the region. Israel can be a beacon of light and peace and prosperity for the entire Middle East. So that is what drives us to have an equal treatment of the state of Israel and to bring justice and peace to the region. Now, as the subject of this webinar is the current case pending for the International Criminal Court about the situation in Palestine, we have over the last weeks conferred with the people in our network and got all kinds of ideas that we are contemplating in order to keep the pressure on the new prosecutor and to try and convince him not to pursue this case and to drop the idea of an investigation. I would like now to hand over to my colleague, Andrew, who will speak about the international legal details of this approach. Andrew, please go. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you can see, we're sharing a screen that's very effective and efficient. What I'd like to share with you, we've prepared a little paper which I think David and Moimir will be happy to share with participants, and I have a short PowerPoint presentation which I'd like to share with you. So if you'll allow me, I'll go to that presentation. And here we go. So just to back up a little bit on where we got to last week, what I'd like to do is share with you, I think as we think about the arguments and the strategy for confronting this, we have to realize we have a decision by the pre-trial chamber, which is not subject to appeal directly. It is a decision on the jurisdiction of the court only. It's not a decision about what the court will necessarily do. However, the prosecutor, the current prosecutor, Mrs. Bensouda, who finishes her term in June this year from Ghana, she made it very clear in December 2019 that she's come to the view that, in her view, war crimes have been committed on the territory of Palestine. So her question was, does the court have jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute those crimes? And that's why the question came to the pre-trial chamber about, is Palestine a state party for the purposes of Article 12 of the statute, which governs the court's jurisdiction. Now, the ICC is set up by the Statute of Rome. So everything that's done within the ICC is governed by that statute. The prosecutor, the new prosecutor is Mr. Karim Khan, he's a UK barrister, a very highly rated QC who has a practice in international criminal law. He will take over in June of this year, and he's currently on a project for the United Nations in Iraq to protect cultural heritage from destruction by ISIS. So he's a very, very busy chap at the moment, and he won't really get his head around this until he joins the court in June. I think until June, the current prosecutor is not going to be taking any action, even although she said she intends to start an investigation. In all likelihood, it will be left to the new prosecutor to re-look at this question, whether to open the investigation or not. The ICC is governed by the assemblies of state parties. I think this is very important. At the end of the day, it's the Assembly of State Parties which has the overall governance of the ICC. So there are really two main parties really who I think would be the subject of any action that might be taken. One is the Assemblies of State Parties. Now, obviously, that consists of the states that Ambassador Katz has mentioned. A number of them have already expressed their dissatisfaction with that decision. However, probably it's fair to say a majority of the 123 state parties would be in favour of the court having jurisdiction. So any state party that wants to initiate some kind of dispute within the state parties, which would be possible, would have to take into account the politics of this, which would be challenging to say the least. The prosecutor, it's not possible at the moment to directly, I think, influence the prosecutor in a formal sense. Obviously, in an informal sense, it is possible, but I think you'd have to think through very carefully about how to approach the prosecutor. The prosecutor will work within the boundaries of the Statute of Rome. That's going to be his job. So anything that he does or says will have to be governed by the provisions of the statute. So it's going to be important that any position that's taken is very carefully positioned within the opportunity there is within the Rome Statute, and I'll come to that in a moment. Then obviously there's the court itself, which is a major player, and the court may have an opportunity later if an investigation is opened. And the court mentioned this in its decision 2 weeks ago, that there will be opportunities potentially for revisiting the question of jurisdiction later. The court said this is a view that's taken now to enable the prosecutor to move forward if she or he thinks that's the right thing to do. But they clearly flagged the opportunity later for either anybody who is indicted or perhaps even a state party to raise the question of jurisdiction later. So it's important that that's borne in mind. I think another point just to mention, the court is under a lot of pressure at the moment. At the end of last year, an independent panel of experts came out with their conclusions and recommendations. The court is going to have to go through a significant review of its own internal workings, and part of that is about setting its own priorities. And one of the things the experts have said very clearly is that the court must remain faithful to its core constituents' calling, and that is to focus on the most serious crimes. It has limited resources, and therefore that's going to be an argument going forward that can be made. So as David's already mentioned, the court was established to end impunity for the most serious crimes, not any crime. And so in any decision that the prosecutor will make to open the investigation, which I think technically has not been done yet, decision will have to be made, obviously, to weigh up this case against the other situations that are before the prosecutor. And there are many that are currently before the prosecutor. So one of the questions will be, is this really a serious enough case? And we'll come back to the moment when it comes to the issue of gravity, but the prosecutor clearly still has a discretion here. And that's the main point, I think, to notice. The next point, I think, concerning jurisdiction, should this matter arise again, I think the biggest problem with the decision that the court has made, the pre-trial chamber has made, is that what the prosecutor was hoping for was certainty, jurisdictional certainty. That's why she put the question to the court. And really, for many reasons, the decision that the court has come up with is giving much less certainty than the prosecutor would have liked, because there are so many question marks about this question of statehood. And the choice that the court has made not to look at general principles of international law, I think, is going to come back to, as a boomerang, to haunt the court. The International Criminal Court does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within the overall construct of international law. And I think one of the strongest arguments that should be made is that the court cannot isolate itself from general principles of international law. The interpretation the court has made to say that we only look at whether this is a state that has exceeded fundamentally undermines the idea that this court is set up by states and it derives its jurisdiction from states. It's a delegated jurisdiction. The court has no power, no authority to look at any case that is not given to it by the states which set up the International Criminal Court. And therefore, if Palestine does not have authority or jurisdiction to prosecute criminals, the court itself cannot have that jurisdiction. And therefore, the mere fact of being a party to the treaty is not enough to give the court jurisdiction. And that's an argument we could go into in more detail, but I think is probably the main argument. Now, the court makes, I think, a second line of argument, and I'm going to mention really 4 lines of argument that I think are key to be thinking about as we think of lines of attacking this decision or seeking to raise arguments before the state parties or before the prosecutor or the court itself. And the second one, apart from jurisdiction, is this question of self-determination. And really what the court is saying is that the fact that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination amounts to a right to statehood. And the fact that the UN General Assembly has acknowledge this right to statehood is enough to give the Palestinians a place at the table. And that's, I think, a fundamental misconception about the right to self-determination. There are two kinds of self-determination, internal and external. This is not a case of decolonization. We're not talking here about a decolonization process like the recent Chagos Islands case before the International Court of Justice. We're talking here about really an internal process which can only take place by way of negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. There is no pathway outside negotiations for the Palestinians to achieve their goal of self-determination, and they've agreed to themselves in the Oslo Accords. So the court has said that it's not necessary to look at the Oslo Accords. Again, this is really problematic because the Palestinians themselves, the PLO, has committed to the Oslo Accords, and therefore it's a limitation on the PLO itself. And under the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians have no criminal jurisdiction over Israelis. This is a really important point that I think needs to be stressed. I'll move on quickly to the question of settlements. There are two kinds of crimes that the prosecutor has said that she wants to investigate. The first are the crimes that have been committed, in her view, by Hamas and by Israelis in relation to the Gaza conflict since 2014. They're war crimes potentially under the Rome Statute, and this is more about disproportional use of force in the context of the conflicts that have been there in relation to the attacks on Hamas, and also, of course, the more recent attempts by the Hamas to storm the fence. That's one set of crimes. The second set, which is completely different, is about settlements. And this is perhaps the most important crime that I think the prosecutor wants to attack. This is Article 8(2)(b)(8) of the Rome Statute. This is the very provision that caused Israel not to become a party to the Rome Statute because they knew this would come back at them and be used as a political tool to attack settlements. And this is a very difficult provision because it's attacking the policies of Israel to enable settlements to be established, which is a very political issue. We can't avoid the fact that it is in the Rome Statute, so the prosecutor also cannot avoid the possibility of this being a crime. But this opens up a Pandora's box. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for the prosecutor for legal and factual reasons to get into this, what I think will be a nightmare legally of establishing when has there been transfer or deportation of civilians, what is the occupied territory. The question of East Jerusalem will come up definitely because Israel has asserted its sovereignty over East Jerusalem. So I think from a jurisdictional point of view, but also from the perspective of defining the crime, it will be necessary for the prosecutor to establish that East Jerusalem is not part of the state of Israel. And there will be many factual issues. Israel is not going to comply with the court. It's not going to cooperate with the prosecutor. So the prosecutor will have no access to facts on the ground, which it requires Israel's cooperation from. So this is going to take a lot of resources from the court, and I think the prosecutor will have to ask himself the question, is this really a crime that merits the use of the court's very, very limited resources? So I think they're the main issues that I think would need to be dealt with going forward. I'll stop sharing the screen there. I would just close by saying that I think thinking of a program, a strategy for moving forward, I would highly recommend alliancing yourselves as much as possible in the member states with other organizations. I would stress the fact that this is not just about defending Israel, but is also about defending the integrity of the court itself, in defending the integrity of the international criminal system, criminal law system, which is very young. It's only a few decades old, and the court is establishing itself. And by going down this political and highly political process, the court is getting itself for the first time into an area which it's never entered into before. And this would be highly challenging, highly problematic. And there's many opportunities going forward for the court to take a step back and either to not start an investigation, or if it opens investigation, not to go forward with a prosecution. And also the state parties, I think, have an interest in raising their voice within the Assembly to make sure that the court's resources are not used to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Peter. Those are all valuable and practical suggestions, good information. I think it's an excellent point you make that you just can't lobby the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. The office isn't really geared to people coming and trying to petition them and such, but we can try and have influence among the Assembly of State Parties, the 123 members of the International Criminal Court, our own, which are our own countries, and especially those basically Western democracies who filed amicus curiae in this case to say there wasn't jurisdiction to begin this probe of Israel. And some important points there about, it's important arguments as we become active on this, that you're not only defending Israel, you're defending the integrity of the court, helping the court defend its own integrity. And I think it's a very important point that to allow this to continue, you are undermining, I don't want to say the peace process, but the prospects for peace in the region, because you take away any Palestinian incentive to have direct talks with Israel if you're handing them victories out here in UN forums, in the ICC and whatever. This has been the game for quite 2 decades now of trying to get what they want, bypassing direct negotiations with Israel, and that just undermines the entire prospects for peace. Okay, we want to now go to my colleague, Dr. Mormir Kalos, to give some Christian Embassy perspective on what we can be doing. The Christian Embassy is unique in that we have a broad network of branches, and we have serious activists and serious leaders of these branches who we've done petitions before. I think just a couple of years ago, when the UNESCO was denying the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, we had a very simple campaign: send them Bibles. They got inundated with Bibles, and said, please stop. And the next year, the resolutions on Jerusalem were different. They acknowledged the Jewish connection to the city. So we've had good, successful campaigns, and particularly on the issue of Jerusalem. And Mormir will walk us through this, but I'll just say it's a pleasure to work with him. He grew up in the behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia and became a believer then. He has a doctor's in mathematics and knows all the mathematician jokes and has run the Czech branch. They've been very effective in lobbying for Israel there in Prague, and really have an impact in the European Union and in the new democracies in Eastern Europe, and now working with us as our Vice President of the Christian Embassy for International Affairs. Mormir.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to participate in this important webinar and the endeavor to do something. And I think Noam Katz put it very clearly. The decision we talk about is shameful, wrong, and destructive, both legally and morally. And we believe it is our duty to raise our voices in defense of truth and moral clarity. And we have already heard something about the substance of the cause last week and also this week, about the possible implications of the decision of the pretrial chamber. And so, as David said, now is the time to consider possible avenues of action. And as we already heard, we have no direct access to the ICC as laymen, but we can approach the state parties, those who ratified Rome Statute. So this is going to be our main approach. But we can also do something else. We can give some indirect support to this advocacy effort by simply publicly raising our voices. So this will be the basis of what we are suggesting. We're going to launch a global petition or a campaign. Very likely we are going to address it to the Assembly of State Parties in The Hague, to the Secretariat. And it will be calling on these governments of the state parties to bring the issue to the attention of the Assembly. They, as we heard, the ICC is governed by the Assembly, and the state parties can initiate some actions. They can challenge the admissibility of the case, for instance. And in parallel, we are going to work with activists, advocates in some of these countries, as many as possible. We will seek alliances with other groups and organizations, and we are looking for people who have the experience, who have the access to their elected officials and the governments, and we are going to offer them as a tool something which was drafted by our partners from Think. It's a brochure summing up the case and some of the main arguments. So in other words, this lobbying effort will be supported by the global petition, which will show widespread popular concern over this issue. And the more signatures we manage to collect, the stronger will be the political influence behind this whole campaign, and the governments should take note. I will just now repeat some of the points that we already heard, some of the major flaws from the perspective of some talking points that we can use when we are trying to reach and lobby our governments. Essentially, as we heard, the court has ruled that Palestine can be considered a state for the purpose of the Rome Statute, which is itself a very problematic decision, criticized also by the dissenting judge, and that the court therefore has jurisdiction over all the disputed territories, which include Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And then, as a consequence, the court could potentially open an investigation against Israel for alleged war crimes. And these crimes can include also the fact that Jews are building houses and kindergartens in a territory which is disputed. So that they can see already the absurdity of the argumentation. It is also important to note that this decision of the pretrial chamber, consisting of 3 judges, was not unanimous. And the presiding judge, Pieter from Hungary, submitted his own 160-page dissenting opinion, with the conclusion that, in his words, neither the majority's approach nor its reasoning is appropriate in answering the question. In other words, this is a very strong criticism of the majority decision itself. And he scathingly noted that they have no legal basis in the Rome Statute, and even less so in public international law, and that acrobatics with provisions of the statute cannot mask legal reality. Now, I believe that these are strong words which could be used in showing clearly that the decision of the pretrial chamber itself is far from being clear, giving any legal certainty. Quite the contrary, it is a strong signal of doubt about the whole admissibility of the case. What are some of the major flaws? The decision blurs the line between politics and law. The ICC, in its determination that Palestine can be considered a state, has relied on political proclamations of the United Nations General Assembly rather than on international law, which is a problem because this is the task of the court to be working according to principles, established principles of international law. And we know that Palestine does not meet the criteria of statehood, which is something that is generally accepted. The Montevideo Convention provides that a state must possess a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to conduct international relations. And Palestine clearly does not satisfy this criteria. And the fact that the court decided not to use this legal test should be brought to the attention of the state parties, because those countries which actually established the ICC should have interest in upholding the integrity and the reputation of the court. So that's one of the arguments. Otherwise, the ICC would just go down the path of becoming another politicized institution with very limited reputation and power. Secondly, the court, in trying to answer the question to which territory this jurisdiction should extend, it has in fact defined borders, but this is certainly not the role of the court to do. And in doing so, it's also remarkable the way how they did it. They simply accepted one side, the maximalist Palestinian territorial claims, which include all of Gaza, West Bank, and even East Jerusalem, to which Israel has claimed full sovereignty. And they did not consider the Israeli position at all. By doing this, the court basically, in fact, prejudged the outcome of negotiations. And we know that negotiations is the only mechanism that can settle this dispute and define the borders. So as a consequence, such approach by the court rewards Palestinian intransigence, undermines the prospects for peace. And now this is another talking point to the governments, because most governments publicly support the negotiated settlement, the so-called two-state solution, or whatever else might come out of it, but a negotiated settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So it should be in the interest of the states to point out the flaws of this decision. The fact that that kind of decision, prejudging the outcome of negotiations, goes against the stated policy. Thirdly, the court has disregarded the Oslo Accords. Again, very important point that Andrew elaborated on very clearly. The Oslo Accord stipulates clearly that the Palestinian Authority has no jurisdiction over Israeli citizens anywhere in the disputed territories. No matter if we consider PA a state, no matter what the borders are, it is absolutely clear that they do not have any jurisdiction over Israelis. Therefore, they cannot offer their jurisdiction to the court because they don't have any. And that's one of the most fundamental flaws of the whole decision, because by ignoring valid agreements, the court simply jeopardizes the binding nature of any international agreements. And the result can only be chaos. And we recommend that especially the witnesses to the Oslo agreements should voice their alarm at such a turn of events, recalling that the witnesses include the USA. So even though the US is not party to the ICC, it is the witness to the Oslo agreements. So it should take action when it sees that the foundations are being destroyed. Then the next party is the European Union. So any state of the EU would find an argument to use. And then Norway, and then Russia. And finally, fourthly, I believe there's another good argument consisting in the fact that the majority chose to ignore the opinion, the written submissions of 7 states, parties to the ICC, which had argued that Palestine does not fulfill the criteria for a state. They had submitted at the call of the pretrial chamber their submissions already a year ago. And my comment is that their involvement is unprecedented because they did not make their submissions in their own defense. Rather, they waded in on an issue which does not directly involve them. So it could be argued that they did so because they felt it was a matter of principle. It was something really important, and I think they were right. So they had made their submissions, and then a year ago, and when the decision of the pretrial chamber was announced 2 weeks ago, they went public again, and they repeated their original stance. They said this decision doesn't change anything in their opinion. They still don't consider Palestine a state according to international law. So we suggest that these countries have interest to continue pursuing this cause at the ICC, do something about the fact that they have been ignored, and they could be encouraged to bring it up to the attention of the whole assembly. Just to recall, the 7 countries are Australia, Austria, Brazil, the Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, and Uganda. So I think the first priority would be to look for our allies in these 7 countries and to approach their governments and encourage them also with the help of our petition to do something about it. But there are many more states which were silent up to now, but who could also be approached. And this is where we really rely on our global network of friends and organizations and allies who could start some action. So in summary, we believe that there are steps that could be taken. They should be done in the direction towards the member states. And in addition, we call upon our global constituency to make a public stand for Israel, public stand for the truth, for common sense, by joining the petition against the decision of the ICC. And we call upon these people, these friends and allies, to run with the cause, approach their governments, and encourage them to go forward. You know, that reminds me of my famous favorite quote by George Orwell. His quote is saying that sometimes the first duty of intelligent men is the restatement of the obvious. I'm afraid we are coming to such a time, and we should make an effort so that the obvious is not blurred by strange arguments or flawed arguments, and that the obvious is restated again and again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mormir. That was excellent. I'm writing as fast as I can here, so please share your notes with me, though. Just to reiterate that, you know, it's not like you can just lobby the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to drop this. We're hoping the new prosecutor who comes in June is going to be reasonable and really, you know, serious about the role he's playing, very unique and important role in for the international community, and realize this is a waste of time and wrong in many ways. But we will be trying to, you know, have a voice and an influence, and we're encouraging everyone to do this based on what we're learning in this webinar and material that we're going to hand out, that you know, our own countries, whatever country you're from, they are also in, you know, other UN forums or in UN forums. There's 123 states in the International Criminal Court, and we're going to try and, you know, it's good to talk to anyone, but especially if you're in one of these 7 countries, Australia, Austria, Germany, Hungary, Czech Republic, Uganda, I forgot the 7th one.
Brazil,
yeah. And those are especially important, that they've already taken the initiative to very strongly oppose this. And a lot of it has to do with the whole question of the court wrongfully extending its jurisdiction, as we pointed out. Momir, I think it's interesting. I did a little study about how many states have been accepted as member states of the United Nations, won their independence, been recognized as states under the Montevideo Treaty. This was set up, decades ago, part of sort of the Westphalian system that we have today, that a nation can be born in a day. You can get recognized as a state on one day and have a birthday. Rome wasn't built in a day, but today you can get recognized as a state if you meet the 4 main criteria, and the majority of the international community accepts you, recognizes you, and especially it has to be done through the UN Security Council and not the General Assembly. But let's say since 1967, I took that as my takeoff date in modern times, that there have been over 75 countries who went through the process, presented their credentials as a state. We have a defined territory. We have a government in control of it. There's a people who identify. We're united in this identity as being from this state. The main criteria you have to prove. 75. I think South Sudan was number 76 just a couple years ago. And so in 50 some years, you had over 75 countries. That's more than one a year that has been accepted as a legal member of the world community, the community of nations. And Palestine is still trying to get its foot in the door and get accepted without making peace with Israel. And they've been trying to do it this whole time and still haven't really done it. And the question is why, and the problem is they've so tried to manipulate international law in order to get statehood so that they could then continue the conflict with Israel from that more advantageous position. And so far, every time they declare a state, it's sort of stillborn. And I think that's an important and an interesting fact, that all these other nations have been accepted among the family of nations, and Palestine is still trying to do it in a way that avoids making peace with Israel. And I think that is a very strong argument now, that the International Criminal Court is just another bypassing and runaround of direct talks with Israel to make a deal there and gain their self-determination that way. We will be organizing a petition, an online petition for people to sign up. Our branches around the world will give you more information on that as it's set up. Our US branch, Susan Michael, who's with us, is going to help with that. Daryl Heading, we've had good experience between here in Jerusalem and the US branch, especially in some of these online petition drives. We'll have information coming out that gives you also what you need, the background, the facts, to make reasonable, sound arguments for our position. And we also are going to start a social media campaign, and I'll just share this for a minute. Okay, it should be here. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. It's just going to be simple little posters. You can post this on Facebook, share it, forward it and such, just saying this is a war crime. This is not a war crime. Here we have a nice symmetry between Hamas firing rockets from populated areas into Israeli towns and civilian areas, which is a double war crime. You cannot embed your military forces in the middle of civilians and use them as human shields, and then target at the same time civilians, purely an instrument of terror, these Qassam rockets from Gaza. and then it's juxtaposed against Israel's Iron Dome system, which is a missile defense system that shoots down these rockets and protects. It's not an offensive weapon against the Palestinians, but a defensive weapon that is a legitimate act of self-defense. And this is basically a social media campaign we're going to launch to just keep driving this message in the public sphere. Here's another example with a little more detail at the bottom, but you've got a mass grave from the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia in 1995, which a special tribunal was because of the special tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and also the Rwanda massacres that was set, the Rwanda genocide, both of these special tribunals were set up in The Hague to try war crimes. And that's why the International Criminal Court was set up around 20 years ago, so that you don't have these ad hoc special tribunals. You have a permanent standing tribunal, but it's only for the most outrageous cases. And that's an important message, that it's so diluting it when you apply it to and try and drag Israel in on this long politicized conflict where Israel is playing by the rules. And this is juxtaposed against the female Israeli border police who's standing guard in Jerusalem, again, a legitimate right of self-defense against this constant terror and armed conflict which Israel has faced for decades. And one more example, we're probably going to tweak some of these and work on them a bit, but here we have, of course, one of the famous photos. I think it's the most shared photo or used photo on the internet from the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel is right here. It's the barracks at Buchenwald, just moments or a day after they were liberated. And here's these emaciated Jewish prisoners, Holocaust survivors, and then the German Nazi officials were found guilty of war crimes against the Jewish people. Their bid to make Europe Judenrein at the Nuremberg trials, again, a special tribunal to try war crimes. And this is juxtaposed. This is not a war crime. Here's some young Jewish boys playing after school in a settlement in Judea and the West Bank. And we contend the modern day return of Jews to their ancient biblical homeland and indigenous people to this land. It's a matter of historic justice, and it's certainly not a war crime. So we'll be putting those out there. When you see them, make sure to forward them, share them with people, and try and make good use of that. We'll have a whole series coming out as we develop these in coming weeks. Okay, let's see if there's any questions for our friends in The Hague or for Moimir. I'm from Uganda. Okay, someone asked, I think we've just named these nations again, about Uganda. That it was one of the 7 nations that filed opinions with the special chamber, the pretrial chamber, the 3-judge chamber, who handled the question from the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of whether the court had, she said, we think there's been war crimes committed in this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in the Palestinian areas. Do we have jurisdiction to try these, to investigate them? And this pretrial chamber said yes, and there were 7 nations, including Uganda, who raised very significant objections to this. And it's one of the nations that we feel will be very helpful going forward to keep challenging on that issue.
David, we have a question. Yes. From
yes.
From Christine.
Okay.
Christine Williams.
Moimir, this question is for you, but it's also for anybody else that might want to weigh in. One of our attendees was talking about, you guys did a superb job in explaining, first of all, why this is just not a legal investigation. And the comment was case closed. But the delegitimization of Israel, the message it sends out to Iran that the ambassador established so clearly leads to a question I have, and I'm hoping that you could perhaps give us some guidance. There are many watching from different regions of the world and wondering what could they do at a grassroots level. There are many larger organizations sending out letters to the ICC, and that's very important, including to Karim Khan. But in terms of a grassroots level, I'll illustrate a quick couple of examples why I have a grave concern here when it comes to where Israel stands right now. If you look at the US and you look at the Biden administration, who has come forward in support of Israel and has concerns about the ICC, you still have Ilhan Omar pressing Biden to change that position. And in addition to that, news came forward today that South Korea has released $7 billion into the coffers of Iran of frozen assets after consultation with Biden. I find this very concerning. And then you have the Canadian government that switched sides and started to vote on the Palestinian issue for the Palestinians, pro-Palestinians at the UN. And at the beginning of this, there was a statement supporting the ICC, but now perhaps under pressure, there has been an about face and it now supports Israel. But I'm seeing some contradictions, and I'm wondering at a grassroots level whether it's time perhaps where people on an individual level, whatever is feasible as you go from country to country, to lobby certain individuals. You look at a man like Cruz, for example, in the States, to lobby individuals that could raise their voices in Parliament or in Knesset. And another example is the Israel Law Center, because they're tabling a bill now to go through Knesset that will make it illegal in Israel for anybody to participate with the International Criminal Court, otherwise face prison sentences or penalties. And it is totally right. But how do we work at the grassroots level with groups like the Israel Law Center, with certain politicians to be able to make the larger politicians that may be anti-Israel more accountability to the general public, and of course, to what is just on an international level?
That's a great question, and I would say that this is a very much long-term issue. You cannot just change the feelings and the opinions overnight. In my opinion, you have to really start making relationships with people, with local politicians. It's easier to find a friendly voice in the parliament than in the government necessarily, unless you have a friendly government. But we can always start in the parliament. And I would recommend that wherever you are, if you are in a country where the ICJ has a branch already, has an existing structure, then you can hook up with them. You can also find allies in other organizations. The situation will be very different country to country. And then it just takes a sustained effort. You need to find people who would listen to you. You would need to convince them. And what always helps is if these people, if you approach an elected official, if they see that you are not alone, in fact, that there are people behind you. This is why we are launching these campaigns. We are doing petitions, because if you can say, well, there are thousands of people from my country who have signed this petition, then it is a signal that this is something that every elected official should care about. And so that's the general approach, I would say. David, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'd add that this is the product of probably many years of the Palestinians lobbying the prosecutor, because they're in a position where they have countries in the members of the International Criminal Court who were helping them. And it's a serious marker and a serious advance on the Palestinian agenda. And I think it helps if we stay focused on these issues. There's always new things that come up every day that upset us and we want to go. But if you're going to have a campaign like this, I think one of the things that helps us is that this is a slow process, and you have time to build educational campaign and an activist campaign, and who knows who is the Esther out there, to use the Purim analogy, who is the person out there that could really make a difference and start turning this around. You find someone like Ted Cruz in the Senate to be a champion in the Senate on this. You find someone in your own parliament who just won't, let this rest. Because you're up against something that's taken many years to build to this, and Israel knew it was coming, but it looks, to criminalize building a house in, your ancient heartland, or even in East Jerusalem. It's just outrageous that when the world was outraged by the Holocaust and said these things are war crimes, should never happen again, that is now turned as a club against Israel. And we had a question about how do we get some of these materials. We have a briefing paper by our friends at Think in The Hague that we're going to send out. We'll also send out some notations ourselves, suggestions on, the sort of arguments that can be made. For most the people here watching, you registered for this webinar, and we'll send those materials because you've given us your email address. We'll send you those materials so that you'll have them, but we'll also have it through our own email lists, and our other email lists, and on our website, and on our social media. And so you should visit our website, visit back to our Facebook page, and there'll be material there as well that you can take advantage of in this. Anything to add from The Hague? You have to unmute.
Yeah. No, I think it's a long-term thing. It's about changing the narrative as well. The problem is as well that I think Jerusalem is a critical one here. I would also single out East Jerusalem because it's so unique legally and politically. To characterize Jews living in East Jerusalem as settlers who have been transported or deported there is totally absurd. It's a very fundamental historical narrative that we have to reclaim, and I think just again underscoring the historical injustice and absurdity of this, especially the settlements, I'm the most concerned about.
Yeah, and you also have to add that it was the international community itself 100 years ago that recognized the historic Jewish connection to the land, and even in the British Mandate and the San Remo Conference resolutions said they would encourage close Jewish settlement on the land. They use that phrase, and they weren't talking about, there was no green line then. It was all through the land of Israel between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And there's really nothing in international law that has abrogated that right of close Jewish settlement in the land. And whether Israel wants to cede, its sovereignty or its claim to some of these areas in order to achieve peace with the Palestinians, that's their decision as a democratic state. But we'll stand with their claim to the land and the right of these people to live there. And it's important that you're turning into a war crime, something that 100 years ago, the international community said we not only accept and recognize, but we encourage it, and we will work to encourage it. And that's an absurd result that, the Jewish people suffered through the Holocaust after that, and now you want to turn it as a weapon against them. It's outrageous. Okay, any other questions? I know we've got our guys from Australia here, Dan Stega, Bill Rizopoulos. Australia was one of the countries that stood up and opposed this.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm glad that Australia made this time took a better position. Let me just quickly read to you the quote actually from our Foreign Minister Maurice Payne. She has expressed deep concerns and made them very clear about the ruling, and our position is the following. Australia does not recognize a state of Palestine. Matters relating to borders can only be resolved through direct negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, which is exactly what Think mentioned earlier as well. We made clear in our observations submitted to the pre-trial chamber that Australia does not recognize the right of any so-called state of Palestine to accede to the Rome Statute of the ICC, and they should not exercise jurisdiction in this matter. And I think bringing it right back as well to the statehood, where we really have a, when you climb up a mountain, you got something in the mountain that you can hold on to, and challenging that position there, and therefore as well the jurisdiction derived from that. So yeah, that's a good statement this time. So it's good to hear. And I think even the encouragement there to the people listening to this is really finding quickly, and it's pretty obvious by looking at past rulings and past standings, where are the people standing that represent your country in this matter, and then you have to, even reaching out, to the ICJ, as it was mentioned in the chats, but also, the collaboration between Think, and the ICJ to even get support from us to have an adapted and an agile strategy. Every single country needs to have a strategy that is really working based on the people that you got to play with by the rule book that you have in your country. Yeah, so that's a quick comment there from my side. Thank you.
Okay, anything from Susan Michael, our national director in the US, or Daryl, her deputy, who is helping set up the online petition? The petition is going to be addressed to the Assembly of State Parties, the 123 members, states of the International Criminal Court, to try, and we think that's the place where you can lobby, and it'll get to the various diplomats who represent these countries at the ICC. And they meet, I think, once or twice a year to oversee the operations of the court, the judges, the prosecutor, and whatever. But they really have a lot of say in how it should be operating. Anything, Susan or Daryl?
Well, Daryl, if you want to jump in, feel free. I'll just say we've talked about it a lot here. And we feel like there'll be a strong grassroots campaign here addressed to the ICC. And I think, we'll do our best to get large numbers on a grassroots campaign to respond to Christine's comments. We're very aware of the problem with the Biden administration, particularly regarding Iran. And so we are aware that that's where our efforts should go if we do a campaign to our government. So right now we see the ICC campaign as focused towards the ICC, but we think it'll be a lot of support for it at the grassroots level. So Daryl, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree, Susan. Thank you for pointing it out. I agree. I think this will be a good campaign even for Americans. It's been noted, of course, that America is not a member of the ICC. It's not a member state. Of course, that the Biden administration actually has come out and condemned this ruling. So there's that part of it, which is, you can't really lobby our government to do anything, and the government here has already spoken out in the capacity that it can. But I think we're going to formulate this campaign in a way that Americans can still voice their disapproval of what's happening and stand up for Israel. And there's a lot of Americans who we know are on our list, and even beyond our list, we believe, that will be more than happy to take a stand on this issue for Israel and give them a voice on it. Just to speak a little bit more to some of what Christine mentioned, and as well as Andrew, regarding some of the issues going forward. I think it's good that we take a response now to this issue. I do think we'll be looking ahead as well and taking that long view on how to respond. We saw it with the issue of the US Embassy in Jerusalem that took, almost 20 years to get to that point. But the precedent that it's set today for Israel, and especially here in the US with the Biden administration that's come in and said they're not going to shift the embassy, they didn't see a problem. Of course, everything's gone to plan. I think it's a good model for us looking forward, issues that we can look at. And even of the issue of East Jerusalem, I do not believe that the Jerusalem issue is by any means settled. And we can look to campaigns and to lobby our governments and potentially here in the US to look for ways that we can secure Israel's sovereignty over united Jerusalem, more than just having an embassy there. So there's that long view, and I think we can circumvent some of the issues that Israel's coming up against in future with what they're facing, both these attacks on its right to its self-defense and its attack to its right of self-determination and the territories that it was given. So it's a twofold thing. So we'll be hitting this now and hitting it hard and getting out there with some great visuals. Thanks for the graphics, David. Those look fantastic for social media. And at the same time, planning on what we can do to really bolster Israel's position in the long term. Thank you.
Okay. We also have a question from our friend in Germany, Christoph Schwamm-Weber. Please.
Thank you very much. I think for us in Germany, the social media campaign is something very good because one of the three pictures is also appealing to the history. So many German people will not have the time, or they are not very documented to study all that legal things. But once we are in the situation that Jews will be accused for crimes, we obviously will say Germany cannot support this after all the crimes that we did. So I might say this not for every country in the world, but at least for us Germans and some other European countries, if the global petition could contain at least one sentence appealing to the history. Yeah, it must not be more, but one sentence that may not make sense for Americans or other Africans, but for Europeans, one sentence appealing to the history that could be more convincing for people because it appeals to emotions than a lot of legal arguments that are very good, but not so much reaching our culture because of our special history that we have with the Jewish people. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. It's an excellent point. And, I feel I want to just pray right now that Germany would really take the lead in fighting this. And I think it's appropriate, it's moral, and it would be just very encouraging, I think, to many, many Israelis too. And we just pray that German leaders right now, our Heavenly Father, would really feel a burden that they can't rest until they see this disposed of properly. And we appreciate Germany opposing this, but it's probably the key voice out there in the family of nations on this question right now, particularly on this. We are drafting up the petition language. By the nature of it, it's got to be sort of broad and consensus to get the most people to sign up on it. But that is a very, very valid point. Okay.
I'd have a comment.
Yes,
I'd have a comment just on the timing of the petition. It's always good to look at a point in time when we want to conclude it and present it and then report back to those who signed it. And as it has been said already, this is a fortunate window of opportunity when the prosecutor is finishing her time and the new prosecutor is coming to the office in June. So we believe we will set the deadline, the target date for the end of the petition sometime before Mr. Khan is entering his new position, probably sometime in June. So this gives us a few months, which is just a perfect opportunity. And there is also a real change that at this time of changing of the guards, this petition could have more impact than otherwise.
Okay, if that's it for now, we just want to thank our guests again. Of course, thanks to Ambassador Noam Katz and Sharon Regev from the Foreign Ministry for their contribution. Hope they're doing well with their families celebrating Purim. Thank you again to Pieter Hoogendoorn and to Andrew Tucker at Think in The Hague. It's really great to have you all as partners in this effort, and thank you for your contributions. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Moimir, thank you again for leading our branches on this initiative, and it's great to have all your experience in dealing with political leaders and the successes you've had there in Prague and Eastern Europe and in other ways. And we just want to invite everyone back next week. Trying to think what is next week's webinar. It's skipping me right now, but we'll have a notice out about it. And let me see. We'll have every Thursday now at 4 o'clock Israel time, a webinar on current events, on Bible teaching, or Torah study with our Jewish rabbi friends, the aid projects that we're doing, and the feast webinars as well, promoting our upcoming feasts. So join us next Thursday.
I think it's going to be Bible study next week. So we
Bible study
into the Bible.
I believe it may be a Purim message from Jürgen.
Right.
I saw him on here, and I hope that's it. Okay, so thank you all again for joining us. Here's the little promo on the ICEJ webinar series once again as we close.